Hello, and welcome to another episode of Trust and Trade, a podcast produced by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Trust and Trade is a podcast for seasoned practitioners interested in deep dives into the areas of competition, consumer protection, and privacy law, and casual listeners who want to better understand the bleeding-edge issues in these fields. Each episode is presented by one of the specialty committees within this section. I'm your host, Anant Raut. This episode is part of our ongoing Mergernomics series, produced and co-hosted by the Mergers and Acquisitions Committee of the Antitrust Law section. Today, we turn our focus to a critical and timely question in merger analysis. How do tariffs redefine product markets? Since Donald Trump returned to the White House last year, the United States has torn up long-standing multilateral trade agreements to pursue bilateral agreements with the stated goal of resetting trade deficits with other parts of the world. A signature element of this administration's trade policy has been the use of tariffs. Since coming into office, the Trump administration has imposed tariffs on a sweeping array of products on nearly all of its trading partners. The U.S. slapped a baseline 10% tariff on nearly all imports, with tariffs for some countries going or threatened to go much higher. But as often been the case, President Trump has imposed or threatened to impose higher tariffs on trading partners one day, only to ratchet them back down or not follow through weeks or months later. The president's rationale for tariffs can sometimes be little more than politics or personal animus. In January, President Trump threatened tariffs of 25% on European nations that resisted his desire to acquire Greenland. And he temporarily increased tariffs on Switzerland because, in his own words, he didn't like the way former President Keller Souter talked to him on the phone. The legality of the tariffs, as of the time of this recording, is under consideration by the Supreme Court. The authority to impose tariffs is vested in Congress under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, but President Trump has claimed nearly unfettered powers to impose tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, claiming that trade deficits are a national emergency. So long as tariffs remain in effect, the trade barriers they create and the resulting increases in the prices of imports have enormous downstream impact on scores of industries here in the U.S. And in our world of antitrust, this matters because it substantially shifts how we think about the size of the markets in which these products are sold, a huge issue when it comes to analyzing the competitive impact of mergers and acquisitions of companies in those markets. Here to help us understand how tariffs redefine the relevant market in merger analysis are Carla Hine and Craig Malam. Carla Hine is counsel at the law firm Weil, Gotshal, and Manges, where she focuses on mergers and acquisitions, joint ventures, and compliance with the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act. Dr. Craig Malam is an antitrust economist who focuses on merger investigations and related litigation. Dr. Malam began his career with the Office of the Chief Economist at the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, or ACCC, where he served for 7 years as senior economic advisor, leading the economic analyses of numerous mergers and conduct investigations. Dr. Malam prepares and presents expert economic analyses for merging parties during all phases of U.S. government and global investigations. Welcome back, Carla and Craig.
Thanks, Anant.
Thanks so much.
Carla, Craig, walk us through how tariffs impact how we define the edges of a product market, especially in industries where global supply is a key competitive constraint.
Sure. So when we think about merger analysis in many product markets, there's often this sort of classic defense that global imports are either part of the relevant market or at least likely to be some sort of competitive restraint. In other words, imports or the threat of imports will keep domestic prices lower than if they didn't exist. But tariffs seem to introduce a lot of noise into that equation. And I wanted to pose this question to Craig. How significant is the risk that markets that otherwise would be exposed to global supply now, or sort of very suddenly snap back to being national because a new tariff is introduced or potentially threatened?
It's a substantial and immediate risk, Carla. So to the extent that a tariff is effective, it adds sufficient cost to the local price of imports such that domestic sales of the imported goods fall. And this is ultimately furthering the stated goals for the tariffs, such as correcting trade imbalances and protecting domestic industry, as well as others, as Anant alluded to or described. Now, this fall in local sales of imports is likely to mean that the relevant antitrust market narrows towards being only a domestic market. And this makes sense if you think about it on a fundamental level, because the goal of market definition is to identify the goods that are serving as a competitive alternative for local buyers. So to the extent that tariffs are successful at causing foreign supplies to no longer provide a competitive constraint on local prices, the relevant market is less likely to include those supplies. to no longer be a relevant market that's global, but to be one that's domestic. So, we likely can't ignore, for example, a 25% tariff. It will change the competitive landscape.
It's kind of like moving the goalposts on what counts as a competitive constraint. I think historically we might have seen sort of near perfect price correlation between domestic and Chinese steel, for example. But now that relationship is broken or sort of, decoupled, if you will, by the tariff wall. And if that foreign supply is suddenly 15 to 20% more expensive on arrival, the local players have a lot more headroom to raise prices without necessarily triggering import substitution. And then the market becomes sort of artificially more concentrated, at least for as long as the tariffs are in place. Thinking about this in practice, as Anant mentioned at the top, you obviously have direct experience with import competition as it relates to merger analyses in Australia, and that comes to mind as sort of this great example of an open economy where the threat of global supply actually does constrain local prices across a number of industries. Could you talk a little bit about your experience there?
Yeah, so I worked for the parties to help them engage with the ACCC in connection to a merger of mining consumables, which was subject to import competition. And so this is a product that's supplied to the mining industry. And as always, the key question for a proposed merger was the actual measurable effect of that import competition and whether that is sufficient in magnitude to indicate that the proposed transaction would or would not be likely to substantially lessen competition. So we were able to show that for this commodity product, imports and the threat of further imports was forcing local suppliers to meet that import parity price. And of course, that's a dynamic that would not be changed by the merger. Effectively, the merger parties were participants in this larger global market, which is a different picture than what would be painted by only looking at their shares or their slices of local supply of the mining consumable.
So, in many ways, we can think of that example and tariffs as a sort of lesson in scenario planning. If, for example, if a jurisdiction like Australia suddenly slapped on significant tariffs, even though they obviously haven't, the analysis for those types of mergers could reach completely different conclusions. And so, a strong defense of global competition could sort of vaporize either with the stroke of a pen or hitting send on a social media post, at least in the current US administration. And parties probably need to think about building in more flexibility and preparing sort of a broader menu of arguments, especially if they need to pivot mid-merger review, depending on what may happen in terms of current events. And I think that's a good segue into discussing the economic tools and evidence that parties may have at their disposal. I mean, since we're focusing on the impact tariffs may have on market definition, I think the hypothetical monopolist test is probably the best place to start. In other words, can the hypothetical monopolist impose a small but significant non-transitory price increase without customers turning to substitutes? And how do tariffs impact how economists apply these tools? I mean, presumably the tariffs would complicate this a fair bit.
Indeed. And so the fundamental question will first be, how has the tariff impacted the landed price or the price that domestic consumers pay? And figuring out that ahead of time is complex because there are different points in the supply chain where some or all of the tariff may be absorbed or passed along in the downstream price.
And that's obviously a bit of a politically contentious issue with different constituencies claiming different outcomes as a result of the current tariffs. I mean, for example, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York just released a study last week finding that Americans paid for nearly 90% of tariffs in 2025, which directly contradicts the Trump administration's talk track on this issue.
Exactly. And so the 90% is kind of on average across a bunch of products where the tariffs have been applied. So in some cases it might be, smaller, and in some cases it probably is 100%. But let's imagine that we can say for sure that a tariff raises the domestic price by 10%, which is a magnitude that is likely to achieve the stated goals for the tariffs. Then if we had a relevant market for which a HMT or the hypothetical monopolist test could only pass with the inclusion of the imported goods, that HMT may instead pass without the inclusion of the imported goods. And the reason is that consumers are less likely to substitute to those now more expensive imported goods.
So I think breaking this down, the hypothetical monopolist test asks whether, in relation to a candidate set of products, a hypothetical monopolist would raise prices by a small but significant amount, say 5, 10%. The idea being that sort of insufficient leakage from that product group in terms of consumer substitution suggests that that is the right market definition, that market is well defined, and that all the reasonable substitutes have been identified. But now we're saying one of those products becomes more expensive, and so it might not get included.
Yes, exactly. So previously, the diversion or the leakage to those imported goods was sufficient for the HMT not to pass, i.e., because that was so great, those products had to be included. The hypothetical monopolist could not profitably raise the price due to that leakage. So the test showed that the imported goods had to be included. But now, since they are more expensive, there would be less leakage. And so they no longer need to be included. The price increase is profitable for the hypothetical monopolist without including them. And that's essentially because consumers have fewer places to go in the face of that hypothetical price increase.
Okay, got it.
And, worth noting, this is a simplified example, and we've skipped over some potential complexities that are pretty likely in most situations. But I think that is the basic idea of how a tariff-based price increase for an imported good could play out in circumstances where, the imported good is instrumental for competition in the market.
And, we mentioned price correlation, earlier. I mean, do price correlation analyses still matter? I mean, I imagine those get distorted in this sort of situation. If prices were correlated globally, then a tariff could cause that relationship to decouple. Or would you need to be careful not to rely on historical data that predates the tariff regime?
Yes, we could expect to see tariffs creating a wedge between the prices of internationally traded goods. However, price correlation analyses are usually only potentially helpful in this context for showing that two goods are unlikely to be substitutes, essentially because there's no correlation. But correlation on its own does not prove that the two goods are substitutes, because there could be other code-determining factors that need to be controlled for that are moving the prices. So to the extent that domestic demand is a driving factor in any price correlation, then tariffs are likely to diminish that effect if an import is made substantially more expensive, like in the example we talked about before.
So, thinking about this in practice, agencies and courts need to see tangible, persuasive evidence that a merger is likely to substantially lessen competition or tend to create a monopoly. And so, when tariffs are in play, what's the most critical piece of information the merging parties can present to show that overseas entry is still a credible competitive threat?
Yeah, so beyond the economic reasoning in the abstract, the agencies and courts need to see the documented business realities. So in contrast to the example we walked through above, there may be situations where the tariffs are absorbed by the overseas producers. In those cases, parties would need to show that importers remain active in the domestic market, assuming the agencies have a question about this, and that the marketplace will continue to look the way it has up to this point, despite a new or increased tariff being put in place. Another possibility might be that domestic producers respond to the increase in imported goods prices by also raising their prices. This would be likely to complicate things for a transaction that raises concentration in that market. And in those cases, the parties would really need to argue that their combination does nothing to change that inevitable increase in prices or drift up in prices. So in a nutshell, if we can show continued strong import volumes despite the tariff, that's going to be persuasive.
Carla, Craig, while you were talking about leakage, I looked up the quote that President Trump made when he was imposing tariffs. And he said, maybe the children will have $2 instead of $30, and maybe the $2 will cost a couple of bucks more than they would normally, which I think goes to your exact point that tariffs, by creating these boundaries in our world, could lead to concentration and could remove competitive constraints that you have to factor into considering what is your product market.
Yeah, indeed. And I think that whether that is actually playing out in practice is the question. And so I think, I want to turn this kind of question over to Carla to think about strategic takeaways here because, I think there is some potential for trade policies to remain volatile. One administration introduces tariffs, the next rolls them back. What would you advise clients on positioning their market definition advocacy so they don't inadvertently corner themselves, at least at a high level? This would, I imagine, be a potentially important tactical concern for parties contemplating deals in sectors potentially exposed to tariffs.
So I think strategically parties should maintain their arguments for a broader market definition. I mean, to the extent that that's applicable, at least based on structural factors that are resilient to tariff policy changes, or to also consider presenting alternative defenses that hold true even in a national market. I think to your point, Craig, about not cornering themselves in, I think it's important to focus to the extent that tariffs are sort of this main factor in how broad a geographic market is to, sort of acknowledge that. And that way you're not, sort of saying that a product market or geographic market is necessarily this one thing only, but maybe there are these, other factors at play. But by the way, there's all of these other structural reasons or these other defenses that we should really be focusing on rather than the volatility in the trade policy at the moment. I think if the case against the merger is vulnerable to what might be effectively a temporary global trade environment, that argument is a pretty fragile one in the first place and perhaps a bit too tenuous to support the full weight of a merger challenge. I think that's important for parties to keep in mind as well, so it doesn't feel like it's this insurmountable thing that they can't overcome. Instead, parties can sort of sharpen their advocacy around points that are less exposed to that uncertainty. And there may be better ways to frame the competitive picture that puts the level of uncertainty into perspective, or at least doesn't give so much oxygen to a theory of harm rooted in what may be sort of shifting political sands.
Got it. So the theme running through here seems to be about uncertainty and how that impacts the different pieces that go into a market definition analysis. So, stepping back for a minute, the way that uncertainty is dealt with in merger analysis more generally, that can show up on both sides, right? Sometimes in the government's favor and other times in the party's favor. Given those lessons, Carla, how do you think parties can position themselves on the issue of uncertainty on tariffs?
I think a defense of future entry is one example of how uncertainty presents itself in merger analysis. The prospect of entry needs to be likely, timely, and sufficient, and is only considered from the perspective of the next 3 years or less than that. If tariffs effectively shrink a market definition, lifting the tariff is akin to an entry event or a re-entry event, if you will. So when you think about applying a similar lens to a market definition that depends on a given tariff remaining in place, it raises some interesting questions. If the tariff has led to imports declining in a recent period, what other evidence is there to suggest that that situation will actually be sustained? And analogizing this to the defense of likely and timely entry, perhaps the right length of time to think about it is within like a sort of next 3-year time frame.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And so, and now, thinking about this from the agency's perspective, they also will need to deal with uncertainty more generally. And so merger parties may be thinking about how this changes things for them looking forward. How do you think the agency's enforcement priorities might be impacted from this type of uncertainty?
Sure, it's a great question, but it's also a bit challenging to read, kind of read the room right now, just given the reported influence of the current White House on antitrust enforcement generally, and maybe some inconsistencies in that enforcement as well. There's some potential that enforcement priorities in terms of sectors or industries may change over time as the impact of tariffs play out. This could happen if concentration increases are seen in sectors or businesses because of those tariff barriers, but these were not initially named as priorities for enforcement. So I think it's just a function of parties just maintaining flexibility over time and how they approach mergers going forward, and just sort of rolling with the punches.
Carla, Craig, thank you for the discussion on a very timely issue. Just putting on my armchair economist hat for a moment, I think what a lot of enforcers, economists, antitrust practitioners are struggling with is that this is not just a simple XY supply and demand curve that we're dealing with, but there's also a time element here too. How long will some of these tariffs last? Will they be ratcheted down? We even saw how some companies last year quickly bought up critical inputs before tariffs went into effect, almost time shifting the effects that you might expect from tariffs and trade barriers down the road. And so when do you expect to see some of these effects, these economic effects play out? So the great discussion, we'll see what happens with the tariffs going forward, the Supreme Court's decision on the legality of the IEEA. To our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to check out more of our episodes in our Mergernomics series. Be sure to subscribe on your podcast platform of choice and follow us on YouTube. And we'll see you next time on Trust and Trade.